Greetings again everyone, my name's Chris and today we're taking a look at a brand new lens from Sigma. It's another new option in their expanding line of DGDN lenses, which are suitable for full frame mirrorless cameras. The Sigma 105mm f2.8 DGDN macro. For now, it'll be available on L-mount cameras and Sony E mount cameras, and when it's launched, it will cost £700 in the UK, and I imagine about $800 in the US probably. Check online for the final price. I'd like to thank Sigma for loaning me a copy of this lens for testing for a week or so, although as usual, this is a totally independent review. I'll be looking at both its strengths and its weaknesses. A 100mm or so f2.8 macro lens has been a staple choice for all kinds of photographers for many years now because it offers such great versatility. As a macro lens, this one's focal length of 105mm means that you don't have to get too close to your small subject, whatever it is, but neither is it as unwieldy and expensive as a macro lens with a longer focal length. As well as offering 1:1 magnification for your standard macro photography needs at normal distances, it could also be excellent for portrait or subject photography too, giving you nicely out of focus backgrounds and a somewhat tight, short telephoto view. Handy. Never underestimate how much fun macro photography can be though, especially if you have a good imagination. This particular macro lens is tall and slim, although its front glass element is a little wider than others I've seen in the past. We'll see later if that has a positive effect on vignetting. The fit and finish of the lens feel excellent, as usual for one of Sigma's newer lenses. Its construction is a mixture of metal, tough plastic and rubber, weighing 715 grams or about 1.5 pounds, and featuring a good amount of weather sealing, which is evidenced by a thin rubber gasket around the lens mount. The lens also features a customizable aperture ring, which is the same very clever design that I loved on their recent new 85mm lens. It can be set to click at every third of a stop, which is nice and tactile for stills photographers. At the bottom, you can also switch it to turn smoothly, which is very useful for video makers, as that will give you a smoothly changing aperture in your video footage. And on the other side of the lens, there's another switch to lock that aperture ring into automatic mode, in case you're the kind of photographer who doesn't want to use it at all. That aperture ring is such a clever design, and it really does work so well. Next, you get plenty of switches for controlling focus and an autofocus lock button too. It's really handy to have all these controls on the side of your lens rather than buried in the menus of your camera. Then comes the manual focus ring. It's broad and rubberized and turns extremely smoothly, although perhaps just a little more loosely than it could be. It's electronically coupled to the lens's autofocus motor, but I found it responding fairly smoothly to being turned, either quickly or gently. As usual for a macro lens, we see a lot of focus breathing. The image zooms in as you focus more closely. I don't think I've ever seen a macro lens that doesn't exhibit this behaviour though. Now onto autofocus. It works quietly and accurately, I'm pleased to say. It's not quite the quickest autofocus system I've ever seen, but it works fast enough, and you should bear in mind that I'm testing it on a slightly older camera body here. A newer Sony camera will probably run it a bit faster. The lens comes with quite a generous hood and one of Sigma's very nice carry cases, and it has a 62mm filter thread. Something I should point out about the lens is that it does not have its own image stabilization. That's not so much of an issue if you own a Sony camera with stabilization built in, but if you don't, then that's something to bear in mind. Overall though, the lens's build quality really is excellent. It feels so solid in the hand, and I love that versatile aperture ring too. Well, let's move on and take a look at image quality now. I'll start by testing this on a Sony a7R II camera with its full frame 42 megapixel sensor and at normal focus distances. Straight from f2.8, the lens is razor sharp in the middle of the image, excellent resolution, excellent contrast, and over in the corners, also spectacular image quality. You just can't ask for anything sharper than this. although actually stop down to f4 and the most incredibly eagle-eyed among you might just spot an extra edge of perfection there that probably won't be even properly visible through YouTube's compression. The lens stays this sharp down to f11, and f16 and f22 begin to get a little softer due to the effect of diffraction, as you would expect. Overall though, the lens scores 10 out of 10 on a full frame camera. You simply can't get sharper than this. Let's move on to an APS-C camera now, my little Sony A5100 with its smaller 24 megapixel sensor. It's the same story. Straight from f2.8, image quality is ridiculously sharp from the middle of the image and over into the corners. Again, all the way down to f11, the image stays this sharp and punchy. Well, there's nothing more to say here, except that this is obviously a stellar optic. No matter what camera you're shooting with, plenty of sharpness is definitely something you want in a lens like this. And, seeing as it's a macro lens, let's take a look at its close-up image quality. It's good news here, too. Straight from f2.8, the lens remains incredibly sharp at close distances. It stays this sharp down to f8. When you're shooting closer to your subject, the effects of diffraction kick in a little sooner though, so at f11 we start to see a softer image, and f16 and f22 get progressively softer. This lens cannot stop down to f32, which is just as well, really. Still, there's no avoiding the effects of diffraction, so that's another essentially perfect performance again. Now let's take a look at distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. These pictures are taken without any in-camera corrections. The lens projects just a touch of barrel distortion, nothing you'll ever notice in real life. As for vignetting, those corners do look slightly darker at f2.8, but they're a little brighter than average for such a macro lens. Stop down to f4 for some pretty even illumination across the whole image frame. Now let's see how the lens performs against bright lights. Those of you who watch Sigma's announcement videos will know that they have a special team whose job it is to eliminate flaring and ghosting in their lens designs, and this team is called the Ghostbusters, apparently. That must look amazing on your resume. Anyway, whatever their resume looks like, the Ghostbusters have done a great job here, as this Sigma lens shows less flaring than normal for a macro lens. In fact, contrast is holding together very well, as you can see. Next, let's take a look at bokeh. As I mentioned already, this lens can get you some nicely out of focus backgrounds at f2.8, even at normal focus distances. I found the quality of this lens's bokeh to be just good. It's not incredibly smooth, but neither are there any real problems to be seen. And related to bokeh, and particularly relevant for a macro lens, is longitudinal chromatic aberration, so let's take a look. At f2.8, we can see a small amount of yellow and blue colour fringing here around the plane of focus, but it's less than usual for a macro lens. For example, here's Canon's 100mm f2.8 macro L lens for comparison, tested on the same sensor. Stop down to f4 and it's gone, so that's another very good performance for the Sigma lens. Overall, well, so far every new lens in Sigma's DG-DN line for full-frame mirrorless cameras have hit the ball out of the park, and this new macro is no exception at all. It really is incredibly sharp, which should leave owners of L-mount cameras very pleased, and Sony shooters should be delighted too, because it leaves a nice choice of excellent macro lenses open for them. Let's quickly look at 3 for Sony users to compare. Here are the Laowa 100mm f2.8 2:1 macro lens, the new Sigma lens, and on the expensive end of the spectrum, Sony's own 90mm macro lens. That Sony lens's image quality is absolutely legendary, but admittedly no better than this awesome new Sigma lens. However, its focal length of 90mm will be a tiny bit easier to use, although you do have to get closer to your subject. And it does feature image stabilization, so if your camera does not feature image stabilization, then you might want to consider this one, if you can save up for it if your budget stretches that far, considering it costs a huge £850. In the middle of the price range, of course, comes this new Sigma lens. Its image quality really is just as good as the Sony lens. you lose out on image stabilization with it, but that's less of a problem if your camera features stabilization already, and the lens does also feature a very nice aperture ring uniquely, which some people will really like. And the least expensive lens is the Laowa 100mm f2.8 2:1 macro lens. It also features incredible image quality and a very cool 2:1 maximum magnification ratio. However, it's a totally manual lens, manual focus, and on some systems manual aperture, so it'll be much trickier to use than the other two lenses. Having a range of choices like this is a marvellous thing for any consumer. If you choose the new Sigma lens though, you really won't be disappointed. It's as spectacular as it is good value for money, and so it has to come highly recommended.